Welcome to everyone. Welcome from wherever you're joining us today. This is the second Sunday Dharma series. It's a fundraiser for Insight Meditation Community of Washington, D.C. We come together on the second Sunday of each month, each time getting to know and learn from an inspiring Dharma teacher. I'm Ric Chollar. My pronouns are he and him. I teach with IMCW, and I've been part of the organization for about 15 years. And I'm going to be today's host and moderator. We are so happy to see all of you who are here, both all of you who are here live, and then a big hello as well to all you folks that are watching via the recording. Today we are honored to be speaking with teacher, healer, and author Michelle Cassandra Johnson. In a couple of moments we'll introduce and hear from Michelle, but first I'm going to ask your patience as I go over a couple of housekeeping things, and then we do a few important acknowledgments. I want to first thank our today's production team, Margot Kelly, Shannon Lavery, and Glenn Harrison, for all you've done to set up and manage all these logistics that are going on. So many, many thanks. And joining us today is Cheryl Zeviar, who is providing American Sign Language interpretation. Many thanks to you, Cheryl. So glad you're here. Folks, you can also select CC on the Zoom menu and show subtitle to engage closed captioning. If you'd like, we invite you to keep your video camera on so you can see each other and have community in that way. But more important is to manage your connection with us however it is that best takes care of yourselves through the time that we have together. Also, if you have any access needs, please let our team know through notes on the chat. Michelle and I are going to be in conversation for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll make sure to have at least 20 minutes for Michelle to respond to your questions. As you have questions for Michelle throughout our conversation, please put them in the chat. I understand there's a whole phrase that says ask questions here, so we'll try to get to as many questions of yours today as we can. All right, as we begin to settle in, I want to invite us to acknowledge and remember some things we too often forget. Some of the people whose shoulders we're standing on and from whose lives and sacrifices we're benefiting, whose work we continue. So I'm speaking to you today from the place we currently call Washington, D.C., which is the unceded land of the Piscataway and Nacotchtank peoples. And may we honor all traditional custodians of this region. If you wish, I invite you to acknowledge the indigenous people of your region, whether or not you know their names. We pay respects to the enslaved African people who were brought to, held, and sold on this land. Their work, their intellectual property, and so much more taken from them, and their descendants. We recognize, honor, and support the continuing struggle for liberation. And we pay respects to the Asian ancestors from whom these teachings and practices have come and been preserved for the last 2,600 years or so. So now it's time to acknowledge and introduce Michelle. It's my honor to introduce Michelle Cassandra Johnson. Michelle is a social justice activist, author, anti-racism trainer, intuitive healer, yoga teacher, and practitioner. Michelle has led dismantling racism work in so many settings for over 20 years, and she's had 2 decades of practice as a clinical social worker. Michelle published her first book, Skill in Action, Radicalizing Your Yoga Practice to Create a Just World, in 2017. And her newest book, Finding Refuge, Heart Work for Healing Collective Grief, was published in July of 2021. And we were talking about how we're almost exactly at the 1-year birthday of that book being released. So happy birthday. Michelle also has a podcast that she started in 2020, Finding Refuge, where she and her guests explore collective grief and liberation. Michelle's work centers on healing from individual and collective trauma and aligning the heart, mind, body, and spirit. She inspires change that allows people to stand in their humanity and come back into wholeness in a world that fragments most of us. So Michelle has given me permission to take another couple of minutes before we hear from your voice to adapt one of the practices that she has for us in her book, Finding Refuge. It'll be a brief, just about 3-minute breath and heart practice. So to begin, we invite all of you who would like to feel free to sit or stand or lie down, finding a posture that allows you to be both comfortable and awake. You may want to close your eyes or turn a soft gaze downward. And we'll begin paying attention to your body and its breathing. Notice how the body feels as it breathes in and breathes out. Pay attention to how the body may expand as you're breathing in and contract as you breathe out. You might note how the sensation of breathing feels as your breath is coming into your body and the feeling of your body slowly releasing the breath in its exhale. So how is your body feeling? And how is your heart in this moment? Now, if you could, try to bring to mind an object that can represent for you what your heart is feeling and holding at this time. Or maybe it represents how your heart can be broken open. The object can be anything. It can be maybe a picture or card from someone who is dear to you, a pet, a gift or memory item. It could be a tree or a plant, whatever comes to mind. Take a minute to picture that object in your mind's eye. Can you feel your connection with that object you've pictured? And imagine sending loving kindness, compassion, tenderness, and care to that object and to the heartbreak that it represents. Imagine as you continue to breathe that with each breath, the field of your loving kindness, compassion, and tenderness is expanding. It's growing. And it surrounds your object, your heart, and it holds all of you with gentleness, care, and healing. Take just another moment or two resting in this, breathing together. Notice how your heart is feeling in this moment. We invite you to give your heart, your body, and all of yourself the space to feel whatever you feel. Now, when you're ready, I invite you to gently open or raise your eyes and welcome back into the Zoom room. So after all of that talking, it's time to check in with Michelle. So many things about your book and about your work are special to me, and I have a lot of appreciation. One of the things that it does particularly well is its whole emphasis on what it is to know and to understand collective grief, right? As opposed to individual grieving or personal grieving, even that time when an individual or a personal person has multiple losses. That was something I was familiar with, but the notion of all of us healing together is really, really important to me. And I wanted to say that it helped me see something back from 40 years ago a little bit differently. And that was the experience of being a gay man as everyone was dying around me or sick with AIDS. And thinking about that as a collective, also thinking about how collective doesn't mean we're all having the same experience. So I mean, I don't want to keep talking because things that you're going to be telling us, but that notion that for some of us who were marginalized and having the one experience, and so many other people that were having a very different experience, it's really something. So anyway, could you tell us about your own journey and coming to write about collective healing?
Yeah,
Collective
thank you. Yes, thanks, Rick. And thanks for inviting me to be here in this space and for the introduction. I just want to add that my pronouns are she and her, and I'm in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, which is the land of the Saponi, the Cherokee, Catawba, Cherokee, Tutelo, and many other tribes' land. I like to name the place I'm in, and as you did so beautifully, honor the people whose land this is, and that feels very connected to collective grief as well because of the loss and attempted annihilation of Indigenous people. And so just speaking the land we're on feels like an important practice to honor our history and to honor some of that grief and acknowledge it. And I also wanted to appreciate the practice you led and adapted. The object that came to me is actually a rattle. It's a turtle shell rattle that I was gifted in Portland, Oregon when I lived there. And for those of you who may be familiar with Finding Refuge, who've read the book, there's a story about Portland and that time in my life and the loss and transition I was moving through. And a healer gifted this rattle to me. And it's interesting that it came to me during the practice because it's on a shelf. I don't actually use it a lot. I did use it for that year when I was in Portland. And the healer presented it to me as something that could help clear energy. And so as I was thinking about heartbreak, I'm thinking about the unraveling that we're in the middle of, right? Things falling apart in some ways, as they always have, and in some ways that feel very new to me. And the idea of sort of the rattle and the sound of that and that like clearing that happens from the acknowledgement that things are falling apart and sort of allowing them to. I'm not saying that what's going on makes any sense to me right now or that it's okay. I'm not suggesting that. I just think in my experience of practice and experience of being with my grief, often there is some sort of healing that comes from allowing instead of resisting the unraveling. So I wanted to name those things. And I came to Finding Refuge and this body of work and writing this book and thinking about collective grief from a few different places. One, you mentioned not actively a clinical social worker now, but practiced as one for 20 years. And so that means I was in spaces with individuals and working with groups and holding a lot of grief and trauma. I specialized in working with folks who were moving through body image issues or eating disorders. I worked with folks around identity, specifically racial identity work, and racial trauma, healing from racial trauma, and even just acknowledging that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are having this experience in this culture. And when I say culture, in the U.S., that's where I've lived my whole life, where white supremacy is, constantly and sort of, relentingly trying to annihilate us. And holding that grief and trying to invite people into a practice of healing, partnering with me to heal through their grief, I think was this sort of entry into me really thinking about, well, we can talk about individual loss, which we need to, and we need to process that, and people need a space for that. And also we're having this experience of living during a time where many of us are deeply affected by systems of oppression, by harm that is happening. And harm, I was listening to what you said about your experience of collective grief around the AIDS crisis. And I don't know how old I was. I'm about to be 47, but I remember that time. Like, I remember the news stories. I remember having questions. And so while I was not directly affected, I probably was in middle or high school. I just can't remember, but I was, still in high school, or middle school. I still remember feeling like something huge is going on, and I don't understand it. And but I know we're losing people, and I don't understand why we're losing people. So I just named that to say, like, even if we're not directly connected, although we're all connected, but I wasn't personally affected. I didn't know people, or I wasn't aware of knowing people, right, who were dying from AIDS at that time. And I remember the narrative that was being formed about people. And I just remember feeling dissonance around that. So I think, clinical social work brought me to holding collective grief, and this question of why aren't we processing our grief and talking about this collective experience we're having of trauma. And then my own experience of loss and grief. So in Finding Refuge, there are stories about my mother navigating the healthcare system. And in that story, in that experience, I had an awareness that many people were trying to navigate a system that was not prioritizing their health. There's a story about being stopped by the police, which was this experience I had as an individual in a time when many Black and brown folks are being stopped by the police and killed by the police as well, right? So, and there are other stories. There's stories that we're going to talk about, the bees, the honeybees in our collective hive. There's a story about my grandmother in there as well. And so in Finding Refuge, it's my personal narrative, but my personal narrative is always connected to the collective. And so I think that's there's more, but that's some of how I came to this experience of being like, we are part of a collective and we're having this experience. But so importantly, you name this, not the same experience.
Well, thank you. And let's kind of stay with this a little bit, because your book begins with some of how you were affected, and so many, by Trayvon Martin and the trial and the acquittal that came after. And a little bit similar to what you described about you and the HIV and AIDS was, I knew that this was horrendous. I knew that this was, and I knew that I knew enough to know that this was not the first, not the last, but you make such an important point throughout your book around that doesn't mean I'm having the experience that you're having. Mm-hmm. And reading about you and the police, I was reminded how some of my friends talk about how white folks will sometimes, when we hear about something, will go, "Oh my God, I'm shocked. That's not who we are. I'm so surprised." And my friends who were Black and brown and folks of color are like, yeah, no need, no surprise here. So anyway, if you could talk a little bit more about that. And I am going to ask you about a lot of the other losses that you've named, because I hope we get time for that. So.
Yeah. So there's a chapter, it's chapter 5 in Finding Refuge. It's about my grandmother, Dorothy. And in it, my grandmother, Dorothy, was a church usher, and the title of the chapter is Ushering Us. And I'm naming this because in it, it speaks to what you said about experience. There is a concept that I introduced called social location. I didn't create this concept, but it is, many people work with it. It's really about the different identities we embody. And so I am Black. I am a citizen of the US. I am abled. I don't have a physical disability. I haven't been discriminated against because of my body shape or size. I am middle class. I have a master's degree. I'm heterosexual, female, identified cisgender, and more. So social location is really about what are my identities and my points of privilege. So they affect my proximity to power. So because and I often talk about my mom with this example, I'm physically abled. My mother has a physical disability. We are having a different experience as we move about the world and navigate different systems, for example, like the healthcare system. Assumptions are made about her that are not made about me. And in so many ways, the dominant culture is designed for my body to move through spaces just based on ability, physical ability. Now you layer on Blackness to that, and I'm having a different experience. My mother, the culture's not designed for her to move with ease, right? She has to sort of plan and calculate. And so social location is a tool for us to understand, what are my identities? What does that mean about power that I'm assigned? Maybe I don't want the power, but I'm assigned power just because of these identities I embody. And how does that affect my experience? And then what is my responsibility? So because I'm aware that I'm abled and my mother's not, and there are many people who are not physically abled, what is my responsibility? What do I need to do with the privilege and power I have? And who am I in relationship with? And who do I need to take the lead from and listen to? And this speaks to how we're, as we've said, we're having this experience as a collective of, civil rights are under attack and assault. I mean, and so we have so many examples in the last 2 weeks of that, but we're not all having the same experience, and will not be affected in the same ways by, for example, the Supreme Court and the rulings they've recently made, or many other things that are going on in our world. And so it feels like, to me, spiritual practice to understand my social location and the context I'm in, and then what I'm responsible for, and how I do my work. And so it's a really, I think, powerful tool for people. And I think holding this, which spiritual practice asks us to do all the time, this tension of like, yes, we are all one and connected, and yet we're not all having the same experience because of the context we're in. That feels like critical for us to do, and for us to sort of investigate again and again, because the things keep shifting, and also our consciousness keeps changing, shifting, right? We're learning more and evolving. So that's a little bit about how we're not having the same experience. And you mentioned the acquittal of George Zimmerman. In that moment, as a Black person, I was cracked open completely and didn't know what was happening to me. And I always say it wasn't that my Blackness was new, but something about that moment transformed so much for so many, actually. I was having an experience that was so different than my white colleagues, my white friends, right? The white clients I was working with. I had a very different experience. And I had a different experience than the Black women I was in community with who were pregnant at the time. I wasn't. I don't have children. I was having a grief response that was massive, but I wasn't about to bring a child into the world. So this awareness feels so important for us. So that's a little bit about this. We're not having the same experience.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for that. Such an important reminder, and so many things in what you've just said. There is this, it's not a tension, but it's sort of, how do we hold both? What you've described around on the one hand, interconnectedness, and we are all dependent upon and live and share the air and the earth, and, as you say, different experiences. And I think sometimes in spiritual practice places or spaces, one can be emphasized at the exclusion of the other, Mm-hmm. And I know you've had a lot of years as a yoga instructor, and I'm wondering kind of what that was like for you, if you were having one experience, and I don't want to assume that it was a predominantly white, but, I mean, the sort of convert yoga here can be.
Right.
So, anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, that's where my first book, Skill in Action, came from, of this experience of like, we're talking about wholeness and wellness and healing. And we're also in a spiritual crisis because we believe we're separate. And the way this is being practiced doesn't really align with what I understand, which is, I mean, there's so much to learn about yoga and our interconnectedness and our oneness. And as I named earlier, our responsibility. So I was in, I would say most spaces that I was in were predominantly white, where I was practicing or teaching or going through teacher training. And then I created some intentional spaces for BIPOC folks to practice, because our wellness, because of how dominant culture functions, is not prioritized. And so in the context of a wellness system that is, I think, in so many ways as oppressive as other systems because of how it operates and who it includes and who it excludes, we need some safer spaces to practice. And so you're absolutely right. And I think as a child, actually, I recognized, I remember like seeing people who I perceived to be alone, and like at the bus stop, in the grocery store, and I would ask my mom, could we bring them home? She talks about this a lot. And I think I was having this experience of like, we are in connection and we're not, are they lonely? Do they need something? Like I was that child. And so I feel like that sensitivity, of an awareness of our interconnectedness, but also an awareness of how we move past each other and don't connect with each other, that created a lot of tension for me internally. So I know that's like centered in my practice and work. And that was, I mean, from age 5 or 6, I was asking her these questions like, do they need us? And also her modeling. She was a special education teacher for a long time. And I learned a lot about collective care from her and the collective sort of experience from her as well.
You write about your mother with such love, and I was a little bit hesitant to ask in case she was at a different place health-wise than when you. But I would love to hear you say a little bit more about your caring for each other. And one of the things that you name that I related to a lot as a clinical social worker myself was, as you're working with folks engaged in systems, as you say, which are not designed for their liberation, for their health, and in fact, for some clients, they're designed to do the opposite. One of the things you said that really, really spoke to me was you said, working with someone and affirming that, like naming that the experience they're having in this system, it isn't them, it's a effed up system. And you say that just affirming it, just that step can then sometimes become a doorway or open a doorway to another realm of healing. So stuff about your mom, but then also stuff about maybe that affirming the systems.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. My mom, her name's Clara, and she is so dear to me, and she is doing well. And when she was, what Ric is referencing, for those of you who may not have read Finding Refuge or sort of heard me talk about her, the introduction is about the acquittal of George Zimmerman, but the first chapter is about my mother and becoming present with the heart and the heart space and heartbreak, which that makes so much sense when I think about my mom and the heart and our connection through the heart. And so Ric is referencing, she was sick and almost transitioned in 2019, and then in 2020 as well. She got better for a few months and then was sick again. And it was and I know many people experience this with their loved ones. I thought I knew how the system of healthcare worked. I understood oppression in systems. I understood the staff had too many patients. I understood that often their needs were not met either. I mean, I'd worked with healthcare systems as a social worker, so I knew that. And watching my mother and the way she experienced the system that time and time again did not care for her was heartbreaking every time, right? I witnessed it. And I think the lack of embodiment on the people who were tasked with caring for her, that struck me. Like, you are not in your body enough to see you are working with a person who's ill and is dependent upon you. Because my mother was incapacitated, like she was not always lucid, and she's fine. My mom is in a retirement community, going to bingo, going to art class, driving. She is a miracle. I will say that, because she said she was talking to the ancestors. She was on her way out, and it wasn't time. And so she's here. I mean, she's present in the earthly realm. She's still here and she's doing well. And I feel like that can, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I really don't want to interrupt you, but I do want to interrupt you. Just a connection with you.
Yeah.
I had mentioned to you about my mom, and we had such an incredibly beautiful time with mom in an assisted living community that it was dementia that was progressing. At the time of having her in this place, we were thinking maybe a couple of years that we would have. Well, it was 10 years. Wow. And she was so beautifully cared for. And my brother and I were great. We're a great team as well. And so that particular line, and Mom died about 2 years ago, and she lived to be about
Mhm.
102. So what I want to say is, if I'm just so great, that loss and that relationship for me just filled me with gratitude. And so I was really lucky. So I'm sorry I pulled you off, but I appreciate you
No,
doing that way.
yeah, I appreciate you sharing about your mom and your experience, right? And the way that you experience care for her, right? Her being cared
Right.
for, um, and it sounds like also being able to be present in a team and sort of navigating care, which can be challenging for families to do.
Yeah, and you talk about either, I think in your book, but then also an interview with you I watched, how one of the skills or one of the things that you have practiced at, let's say it's now your mom in a hospital, or it's your grandmother with feeding tube maybe, or in
Mhm.
any event, knowing that at the same moment you were a daughter, you were a granddaughter, you were having an incredible experience of about perhaps to lose your dear one.
Mhm.
And what was being called for, you discerned, was a social work intervention, or sort of in this moment, I need to be the person who helps navigate and make decisions. Um, so anyway, I wanted to ask you about that, if it doesn't take you off the topic too much.
No, I think it's great. I mean, we're in conversation and community. That and what you just named has struck me so many times. This experience of, okay, I'm a daughter and I have to make this decision for my mom because she cannot make it right now, and relying on my social work skills to do that. It's like grateful for the skills and my spiritual practice to be present enough to say, what I might want right now is not what is necessary. She's suffering. And so someone has to make a decision about how to respond to that suffering. And I can I can do that from this space of not wanting to lose her. Of course, I don't want to, but with an awareness that everything is temporary too. I remember sitting there being like, I'm not going to be here forever. She's not going to be here forever. She's suffering. So what is my practice calling me to do at this time? And really, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do because I'm making a decision that, yeah, I really wasn't prepared for in so many ways. So it's so many things. And that happened with my grandmother too. And my father, actually, I remember it most with him of being like, he was sharing a story of trauma that no one knew. And it was a shock to me. And I remember being like, you have to be a social worker right now. He needs mental health care right now. And so just being in that moment of not separation from who I was or disembodiment. Um, and I do think spiritual practice helped with this so much, but this moment of, this is what's being called for, so I'm going to lean into this now and make this decision. And I feel like there's so many times where we may be in situations that we didn't expect, where we're being called to respond from these different roles or identities. So that may resonate with people, particularly around trauma and crisis and anticipatory grief and loss. That those are the moments where spiritual practice is like, what is needed right now? How do we respond to this suffering?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. I it leads me to a question I'm sure you get asked a lot, and I was thinking maybe that would come more towards the end, but self-care. So
Mm-hmm.
as someone who's a healer and in so many different settings with so many different kinds of energies and community stuff coming at you, um, could you talk some about sort of the journey you've had around taking care of yourself? Um, and I want to I want to confess that one of the things in, again, don't know if it was the book or in interviews I saw, the question was asked, and it was such an important question about moments where maybe whiteness or maybe something that is said would pull you in one direction. Um, and how do you take care of yourself in those spaces when not the most respectful, greatest thing is coming at you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love this question about and practice of self-care, and it's definitely been a journey um, for a few reasons. One of which is I am in a Black body, as I've named, and you can see, and my care based on race isn't prioritized as we've named, and so people talk about it being radical for us, those of us who are brown and Black or marginalized in any way, to care for ourselves, and it only feels radical because we have to create ways to do that in a culture that says you don't matter, right? It's like it shouldn't actually be radical for me to like care for myself or take time to do that, but it is, given the context, it feels that way. And I feel like spiritual practice, I mean, it is like the well that I go back to over and over to care for myself. And what I want to say about the times we're moving through right now and have been over the last few years is that, and this has happened at other points in my life, is that my self-care practices have had to adapt to try to respond to the sort of current context, right? Politically, emotionally, the landscape, family-wise, what's going on, COVID, right? Like I didn't expect to be in a body living through a time where we'd have a global pandemic, and yet here we all are. And so my practice of sitting on my cushion in the morning is wonderful. And at the beginning of COVID, it wasn't meeting what I needed. It was helping me, but I needed more, right? Or I needed to be in my garden, or I needed to connect with friends, or I needed to sit and pray, or I needed to change my prayer, or I needed to make offerings to my ancestors. I have so many practices that I engage in, or I needed, and I'm on sabbatical right now, actually, to take time off. I planned that in 2020, planned for it to happen now, but it began in 2020. It's like, I'm going to need some space. And I think it's so important for folks to recognize that practice is like vital, and it may need to shift based on what you're moving through. And there's so much for us to practice. So I feel like it's sort of limitless in that way. And maybe for some people, the same practices work. I just know in my experience, I've had to adapt to meet the uncertainty, to meet the level of crisis we're moving through, or what I know about it, or how it's affecting me. And we live in a grind culture that says, don't prioritize your care, to everyone, actually, work yourself to death. And I'm just not going to do that. Like, there's so much work to do, and I'm constantly overwhelmed by the world. And I know I can't do all of the work. And I'm at peace with that. Like, I'm very much at peace with that. I will do what I can. And I think about it every day, what I can do. And I also need to think about how to care for myself so I can sustain the work that I'm tasked with doing through my Dharma. And yeah.
Is boundary setting part of this too? I heard you talk about something along the lines of being able to, you give what you can, and there's transparency, and it flows through you in a space. And then as you leave the space, hopefully not carrying too much of that with you on.
Yes, boundaries. I love boundaries, and clinical social work taught me a lot about boundaries. Thank you. And life did as well. And overworking and illness did as well, right? There's so many lessons from that in my experience. And in particular, in Oregon, when I was living there for a year, I lived there for a year, and as I named earlier, went through so much loss while I was there, and just a lot of change I wasn't expecting. I was working in an organization where I said no more than I had ever said in a space. And I didn't like it because it didn't feel like me. Meaning saying, no, I've got to reassert this boundary over and over and over. I'm not going to do it this way. We made these agreements. Why aren't we honoring these agreements? I mean, I said no all the time for myself and for other people, in the spirit of wanting us to take care of ourselves as we did the work we were doing, which was really challenging work. And I feel like it was so important to sort of model those boundaries and set those, because no one else was going to do it. And the institution wasn't going to do it. And so I was like, okay, this is your role this year, to say no to so many things. So I know boundaries are really challenging for people, and we have different conditioning and sort of socialization around boundaries and what we can say no to, and family stuff around boundaries. And boundaries feel so tied to self-care and self-preservation, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the practices you talk about, that's really, you show how important it is to you, is ancestors. You're calling in, your work with, you're honoring your gratitude towards ancestors. Tell us about how that is for you, what it means, some of what you do.
Yes, I want to say it's ancestor work can be tricky. And that makes sense given our shared history, and how intertwined we are, and also our different social locations within that based on our ancestry, and also whether or not we can trace back where we're from as well. Like I have a lot of stuff around that, and wanting to know more about my origin story, my roots, and the roots of my people. And I've been engaged in ancestor work, and when I say work, I'll describe that. What I mean is offerings to the ancestors, the earth as a living ancestor, teachers as ancestors, lineage as an ancestor, that kind of thing for many, many years. When my grandmother Dorothy transitioned, she was the first ancestor I felt right away. And I was with her. There's a whole story in Finding Refuge about my experience of being with her. I wasn't supposed to be there. I was there. I'm sure she called me to be there in the way I was there and witnessing her, and calling for people to humanize her and her transition. And it's like the moment she transitioned, I felt her around me, and I felt her readiness to support me. And she was like that in her time on the earthly realm. Like it didn't feel, the quality of it felt similar, but it was expansive in this way. And since that time of her transition, I feel her all the time. Like in spaces, I'll feel her around me. I'll feel her hand on me, on my back, typically where she is. I will call on her to support me. I have an ancestor altar behind me. Her picture's there, several pictures of her and my grandfather, Fred, and some other ancestors. And I make offerings to her. I sit in meditation and ask what she might want, or she'll just tell me before I ask, and I'll make offerings. And I love my connection with her and my other ancestors, in particular, the well ancestors. And I'll say something about the ancestors that may need some more healing. But I love my connection with my well ancestors because it feels like I have a whole team who's like guiding me, and I'm willing to be led by them and by spirit too. And there's a connection between my ancestors and spirit. And so I feel really grateful that I was open enough to feel my grandmother's readiness to show up in the way that she has and continues to. My father transitioned before my grandmother. My grandmother Dorothy was my mom's mom, but my father transitioned in July of 2017. My grandmother transitioned in November of 2017. And my father and I had a very complex relationship, and he wasn't well physically, emotionally, mentally in his time in this realm. And I felt like his transition was, I don't know much about it, but I felt like it was probably pretty traumatic. And I felt like he had more healing work to do. And so for about 3 years, I set boundaries around him. Like I didn't want him in my space. I didn't want him around me. His picture is on my ancestor altar, to be clear, but I didn't want his energy because he wasn't well. And I'm not saying like I'm in relationship with him. I'm clear. I'm his daughter, and I care about him and cared about him in his transition. I just didn't want I didn't want to have to carry the heaviness of his sort of trauma and the healing work he needed to do. And then that shifted He felt different. His energy felt different. I have a wind chime that's connected to him and his transition, and it felt different. As it rang, the tone of it. And so I was like, okay, maybe he's released something, or maybe he's ready. And I just named this because many people have ancestors that are unwell, or that we may not want in our space. And I don't mean that we can separate from our lineage in that way, but we may not. I do think we can do our healing work, and hopefully that will heal our ancestors, heal back, and we can heal in the present, and we can heal forward. I just want people to know I don't feel like we have to carry the weight of all of that healing work for ancestors that have transitioned and were not able to do that healing work when they were alive. So there's a lot with ancestors. And I actually think more and more people are asking about ancestors because of the time we're living through right now. Like, I just think it's come up in so many spaces where I think people are like, what is this connection with the people who came before me? And what does it mean about how I show up now? And what is my responsibility? And what is the narrative? And as Lama Rod Owens always says, somewhere in the line, there was some well ancestors. Somewhere there was a well ancestor. So if people are like, I don't have any, somewhere. And I'll also say the earth is an ancestor we can work with. The elements, ancestors we can work with. If working with people in your bloodline is not for you, then you can connect with other ancestors.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I know as a queer person, I will call in and think about elders and ancestors who, come from a cultural connection that I have.
Mm-hmm.
Also, dear friends who've passed who weren't blood relatives, but very, very much connection. So, yeah, is there any more about how you encourage folks to go for kind of, I don't know, healthy is not the right word, but as you say, well, or helpful ancestors?
Yeah, you mentioned I am an intuitive healer, so that means I work with folks and connect with intuition, and often that includes some ancestral work, and people have questions about it and curiosities about it. And so my assumption is that our well ancestors want to support us.
Okay.
And that sometimes we just have to ask for that support. And sometimes they're waiting for that. And so an entry point into that is folks might sit and sort of think about well ancestors. And again, that can be an element, the earth. It doesn't have to be someone in your bloodline. Some folks might, and this is an invitation in Finding Refuge, write a letter to their ancestors, their well ancestors. And sometimes it's just beginning with, I have a connection to people who came before me. And I want to open that connection more, right? And that can happen in meditation of being open to that enough. And then looking for messages, signs, symbols. And often people find that they come through when they're open to that. There can be fear about working with ancestors or things we can't see or touch. But spirit and spiritual practice feels like it's that, like, often it's not tangible. We're not holding something. Sometimes we are, but sometimes we're not. It's bigger. It's all around. And I feel like ancestral work is very similar. And so I would say beginning with that seed of, I'm open to my well ancestors supporting me, seeing what happens. I need some support from my ancestors in this way, seeing what happens, that kind of thing. Objects from ancestors. I have my grandmother's ushering gloves from church on my ancestor altar. I have her measuring cup from her kitchen where she baked so many biscuits for us on my ancestor altar. From my friend Eric who transitioned, I have a picture of him. I have a heart, a rock connected to him. So that's also a way to bring them in. And it's all, those things are always on my ancestor altar and around me in this space.
You mentioned your friend Eric. That was another beautiful, beautiful chapter. And could you tell us some about that time that you went through and his transition? And particularly, if you wouldn't mind talking about the bench, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So Eric was a dear friend of mine, and he's an ancestor, I feel, a lot of the time, but often he'll show up as dear. I associate with Eric, and that is in the story. And that I associate him with them because of their gentleness and compassion, but also the way they showed up after he transitioned. and sort of continue to have an interesting relationship with him. He had an enlarged heart, and he transitioned when he was 39 years old. And it was a shock. We didn't know he had an enlarged heart until after he transitioned. And I write about, of course, he had an enlarged heart. Energetically is what I talk about in the book, because he was very generous and giving and cared about the planet and the world in just such a deep way. And also, I think he felt tortured because he was so sensitive to the planet and what was going on, and could feel it and couldn't stop some of what we are doing now. I think there was a lot of dissonance in him because of that, and because of caring so much. And after he transitioned, we planted a tree in one area of the city I was living in. And we also placed a bench. This was his family and friends came together and had a gathering. And it's a very sturdy bench. And we placed it at this place in North Carolina, in Carborough, North Carolina, where I used to live. And for years, I would go and sit on this bench to go be with him. And he actually introduced me to the forest where the bench is located. So I first went there with him. And one day I was walking in the woods and the bench wasn't there. And I thought, I don't know how, this is like big, it's just a sturdy, heavy bench. There's nothing that should have been able to move it. And I, sort of was in shock and like, where did it go? And didn't see it anywhere. And then sometime after the bench disappeared from this location, I was walking in the woods. I was actually walking out of the woods to go on the trail to my car. And the bench was sitting up high, sort of looking down at the creek. And I thought, I don't know how it took 4 people to move it into the forest. And I thought, I don't know how someone moved this up the hill, and it had traveled a mile down the creek. And so we posted a picture on Facebook. That's one reason I do like social media, it gets my nerves, but I like it for this reason. And people started responding and saying, I used to sit on that bench. I saw that bench in the creek a month ago. And we discovered that someone had seen the bench. It has a little plaque on it with a saying about Eric. And they saw the plaque and they realized that it meant something to someone. They realized the bench was special. It wasn't just it was covered in debris when they found it in the creek. They pulled it up the hill and sat it up in this place where hopefully it will not get washed away. And I feel like Eric wanted to move the bench really and have it be up high in this place so he could look down on the creek. That's what I think happened. But I love that it's like, this is what we need to touch into, right? If we think about care, that someone recognized this means something to someone. And I'm going to do what I need to do to get it up this hill because it's special. Like that, and I talk about this with my mom, that she's precious to me and we're precious to one another. That's what that felt like. Like you care enough to do that. You don't even know what this is or why, but you know it's special, and that we need to cultivate more of that. So I appreciate you asking about that because I love that story and love to bring Eric into spaces. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, you're both lucky to be in each other's lives,
Mm-hmm.
So we got to talk about the bees. I just sort of want to say, run with it. I mean, you as beekeeper, some of what you've been through with your hives, lessons that the bees teach. Tell us.
Yes, they are. I love to talk about the bees. And chapter 6 in Finding Refuge is about the hive and our collective hive. And I always say, if you want to learn about justice and community care, you can watch a hive or you can read about a hive if you don't want to be close to a beehive. Although if you're okay and not allergic and feel safe enough, if there's any way for any of you to be close to a hive and the hum and the vibration, I would suggest it. And I've actually been sitting with my bees during this sabbatical time, this break, for about an hour a day. And I have 4 hives. So when I wrote Finding Refuge, I had 2 and I lost one and wrote about that. And the lessons from that, and also the other hive swarmed after I lost this one hive. And so how we can be experiencing loss and also sort of abundance at the same time, and growth and birth. Those things go together. But I sit with my hives every day and just feel into their vibration and their hum, and learn a lot from watching them and how they work for the good of the hive. I know people talk about this, all the good of the hive all the time. It's everything they do is to sustain the hive, and their wisdom around that, and the higher intelligence that bees have, just a deep knowing. I feel like there's so much we can learn from them, and we need them. We need them. And I have a bee teacher, Ariella Daly, who I love, and she's practical and a shamanic beekeeper. And so I'm learning about beekeeping, but also shamanism and bee mythology as well. And she often talks about, people will say, save the bees. And I get why, because we actually are losing colonies, and that has everything to do with the environment, and also beekeeping practices as well, commercial beekeeping practices. And she'll say, people say save the bees, but maybe the bees are here to save us and be in relationship with us and mirror to us, right, through the loss of their colony, what we are risking if we don't actually make the changes we need to take care of our collective and our hive, including the bees, which I think is so beautiful. Like, saving is like, I know what to do, but when we're in relationship, what does it mean, right, to be that connected, where we're thinking about how our actions impact one another, and where we as humans are thinking about how our actions affect the honeybees and the larger ecosystem and environment. And I will just say that the bees have taught me a lot about spirit. They've taught me a lot about magic. They've taught me that they've done things that bees, like beekeepers, will say that they don't do, like live with 2 queens in their hive. That happened recently, where I found 2 queens, and that's sort of, it happens, I think, more than we know, but people will say it's rare for that to happen. They will reveal things. I will dream about them. That's how I knew I'd lost a colony. I had a dream, and then went in and had lost this colony. And what I'll end with the bees is that, when I lost the colony, I remember looking at them and thinking, this is what we are humans are doing. Like, this is what we're doing to each other. This is what we're risking. They were on the bottom board and saw them. And what is interesting about the loss of this colony is that they left a whole box of honey for us. And so I always say, and I wrote this in Finding Refuge, we had to process the sweetness and the gift of their honey. And we had to respond to the loss of the colony. It was such a, it was a spiritual experience. It was really life-changing because I wasn't going to take honey, and I wasn't prepared to take honey, and I had no tools to do it. Like, this was not happening. And once we were in the hive and realized they were not alive anymore, and we had this honey, we were like, my partner and I, we need to process this. And so processing and working with sweetness amid death feels like such a, I don't even know, like, what are the words for that, right? It's such it was a really beautiful experience. And that feels like a gift from them. So just offer that.
Wow, so much, right? And folks, I will encourage you, I encourage you to buy the book, to get the book. And that chapter and the story about the bees, there's even more in there. So it's wonderful. I want to take a moment, speaking to the crowd of us here, to remind you that you can submit questions. And I believe there's an Ask Questions Here prompt on your chat. So we'll be looking for that. I've got a couple of things I wanted to ask you that in some ways tracks back to some things we've said before. With the continual murder of Black bodies, so I'm going to take it to hard place. The number of levels of loss and healing and trauma, there's the experience with each piece of news and loss and grieving. There's the knowledge that it isn't over. And you talk some about anticipatory grief of what's to come. And it makes me think in particular, although it's not just particular to this, but uh, black mothers of black sons. And it's like, just in any event, if you could talk, is there something in particular of guidance or support around the when it's over and over and over again and not over, you know?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking this question and taking us here. And you said, I'm taking us to a hard place. And I thought, well, this is the place we're in. You know, that was kind of my like, and here we are, you know, like this is it. And of course, this isn't the only thing that's going on, but it's something that feels very present to me, along with all the other travesties we are sort of wading through and responding to and navigating. And you know, after the acquittal of after the murder of Trayvon Martin and then the acquittal of George Zimmerman, there were other, I remember that summer, and there were multiple deaths and murders of Black and brown folks. And I remember feeling like a moving target in my body. And, you know, I was a social worker, I was practicing yoga, I had a lot of self-care practices, but they were not meeting the PTSD I was feeling. Like it just didn't, and I just felt so visible. It was, I've had this experience one other time. It was really, and like at risk for being visible in my Black body. Now, you know, I'd been Black for a long time, then I'd always sort of felt that, but not to this degree. It was just like, I can't go outside. Every time I would see a police car, I would have a panic attack in my car. I mean, it was like, what is happening to me? On the way I was going to see this therapist. Then, and on the way to that first appointment, I remember passing a police car, which wasn't even thinking about me, but I had a panic attack. And I was like, and I was late to that first appointment because I was so triggered by that. So that level of hypervigilance was something I had not experienced or wasn't aware. I don't think I had experienced prior to that time. And I remember feeling like I'm trying to grieve the loss of Black and brown people. I'm anticipating the next loss. I'm feeling at risk for myself and the people in my community. And it was just too much. I mean, it was like, I'm going to break, or I am broken right now. Like, I don't know which, but it felt like that. And, you know, my therapy helped me a lot through that. Grounding practices helped me a lot through that. And I'm still responding to it. You know, it sort of, given what's going on in our culture and the as I named earlier, how white supremacy or systems of oppression operate, we're in this space where we don't have enough time to respond to the thing that just happened, and we're anticipating the next thing that might happen. And I think for me over time, I don't want to use the word accepted, but I can't think of another word right now. I've accepted that's where we are. Like, that's what it means to be in my body, human, alive at this time. Is that, and it's not the only thing going on. I also want to say that to be human means I'm responding to the traumas that are going on right now. And I'm aware that we're probably going to create more trauma for each other. And also people are trying to disrupt that pattern too. That's what I meant when I said, it's not the only thing going on. Both people every day, right? Being in this conversation is a disruption to the trauma because we're calling for something different, right? We're naming the truths. From my perspective, I'm naming them, right? And open to others. So I feel like part of our practice is to be present to the heartbreak, is to be present to the grief, is to not live in this place of anticipating the next thing, but knowing that because of how systems work, that things may continue to happen in this manner, the way they are now. And also to know that we can make choices to disrupt, to interrupt. And we also, as so many teachers talk about, can, as many people have before, dream and imagine something different for ourselves. Like, I'm not hopeless. That time of PTSD didn't steal my hope. It just was a really acute period of time where I didn't feel grounded in my body because of what was happening. And now I feel a little more grounded because spiritual practice called me into my body and said, breathe through this, breathe with it, cry with it, remember to breathe as you're crying instead of holding your breath, right? Like that's what practice has done for me. So, that may have offered some tips for people. I don't know if it did, but I think this is where we are. And leaning into it enough to be with it, and then to sort of think about how do we respond and transmute and transform. I think that's what I try to practice.
It's a lot.
It is a lot.
I want to read a question. The questions are coming in. Jenny asks, you spoke a bit about this, but I'm wondering, Michelle, if you could say more about how to reconcile all being one with those who it seems would do harm or want to do harm. How do you balance self-care with what seems to be Buddhist principles around seeing the light in each soul, to be open, keep hope open, you've just talked some about that, and remain open to the best in all people?
Yes, this is thank you, Jenny. This is complex. It's like how do we do this? How do we interrupt the polarization that's happening? How do we, as we talked about it earlier, remember our oneness and the light and divinity is often what I talk about, housed within everyone, while people are actively trying to harm people. And while I make decisions that may harm the planet, it's not what I want to do, but I'm in this capitalist culture and I know I make decisions and choices that harm the planet and harm people. And this question in some ways makes me think about, sometimes, and Jenny, this is not what you said, but your question made me think about it. Some people talk about positive intent and assuming that. And what I always say is sometimes people actually don't have good intentions. There are people who are actively creating policies that are going to harm people. That's real. And when I think about the people who are making policies that are going to actively harm people, I think about how those folks are likely not in their bodies, not in their humanity, and do not remember their divine beings. I can look at them as a divine being, but I recognize for many reasons, we're fragmented. So there are systems that separate us from our humanity and our divinity. And when I'm not in my humanity, I can do all sorts of things to other humans in the earth that are toxic and harmful. And as I named, I probably do, because I'm not always in my humanity. And so I think it's complicated. I just think it's tricky, because what dominant culture wants me to do is to say some folks are evil and bad and some folks are good, and to separate in that way. And spiritual practice is saying, actually, don't do that. And my sort of social justice practice coupled with spiritual practice is calling me to ask the question, what happened to us? What conditions are in place when we're not in our humanity and divinity? And what does that lead to? That's what the pairing calls me into. I don't want to demonize people. And I do think people are doing things that will take us a long time to repair and heal from. And I also include myself again and again in that, which keeps me humble and also calls me into some work and interrogation of how I'm contributing to the sort of separation, right? And the when I've departed from this idea of us being one. So I'm not sure I've reconciled it, but I'm in it, and with it, I have questions. Thank you, Jenny.
Yeah. You also name, I want us to get to one more question. But you also name, for those of us, which is many of us, to see when and how we're complicit.
Yeah.
And it isn't just them who are complicit, how each of us. Okay, we have time, I think, for this one more question. Joanne asks, would you be willing to share the story about how you heard the call to take a sabbatical and how you allowed yourself to listen to it and respond to it? I feel a tug in my mind, body, and soul to make space for deep rest, but I resist it and struggle to make space for the awareness and for the honest conversation with myself and community members who rely on me. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. I love this. It feels complicated too. And I think that because of how dominant culture functions, that many of us may have some either resistance to rest or feel like we're not deserving of rest, or the world is literally on fire. And how can we rest when things are on fire and burning down? Like, I felt all of these things. And I was tired.
Yeah.
I was tired. And I think I had been tired for a long time. And I'm devoted to my Dharma and my practice and my work. And part of that includes rest, because rest feels like an act of care. And it also means I'll be able to sustain this practice and work and my devotion to, in the small way I can, changing the world in some way, or transforming or inspiring people, and changing myself as well. And it also came from someone asking. I used to work with a group called Dismantling Racism Works, and two of my colleagues who are white-bodied, who were part of that collective, they were doing some fundraising for, they were working to redistribute wealth into BIPOC communities. That's what they were doing. And they reached out and said, if we raised some funds for you, how much would you need, and what would you want to do? And I said, I want to take a sabbatical. This was 2 years ago. And they did it. And I just recorded one of my podcast interviews about this. I'm networked with them. I'm connected. Not everyone has that privilege. I just want to honor that, like, people I know reached out to me and said, what do you need? And there are many people who are not getting asked that question. But if we're in a position to ask that, I invite people to do that, especially if you're in closer proximity to power. And then I decided to rest. And I'll just say, for the first like 2 weeks, I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I didn't feel the call to be working at all. I want to be clear about that. But I kind of was like, where does the time go? Did you sit with the bees for 3 hours today? Did you make muffins? Like, did you call your mom? Did you go on a long 2-hour walk? I had no idea. I had to reorient to this doing versus being, because I was like, actually, when you sit with the bees, you're learning a lot. You are doing something. When you mindfully cook in your kitchen, you are. When you have a pleasant conversation with your mom about the world and all that's going on, and a long walk with your dog, you're being in your body. It was like this recalibration, which I definitely needed, and my nervous system needed it. And I think we need it. And I recognize not everyone, for many reasons, has the space to do this. Again, if we're in a position to support people in resting, and that's what they want, whatever their form of rest might look like, I invite us to be in that practice with people.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to those who gave us these questions. It really was wonderful. We have just a couple minutes left, so such gratitude to you, Michelle. Would you be willing to take us for a minute or two, sit before and then we'll come back and I'll do a sharing of merit and metta.
Yes. So I'll invite you to find a way to be in your body, and you can stand, sit. You might even decide you want to move. We'll just be here for a minute or so. Eyes can be open, closed. Hands can rest wherever feels comfortable for you. And I invite you to bring your awareness back to the breath. Ric guided us at the beginning to breathe. I invite you to come back to the breath. And we've shared so much here. So as you breathe, you might be integrating some of what you've heard or felt as we've moved through this conversation and practice together. And once again, I invite you to bring your awareness to your heart, your breath and your heart. You might note how your heart is feeling now. Maybe there are many feelings. And I'll offer a mantra here you might repeat to yourself. And the mantra is, I feel my heart. I feel my heartbeat. I acknowledge my heart. I acknowledge my heartbeat. You might say a line from it or a word, maybe just heart or feel. I feel my heart. I feel my heartbeat. I acknowledge my heart. I acknowledge my heartbeat. I'll invite you to just work with this for a few rounds of breath. And whenever you feel ready, you can continue to work with the mantra or come back into this space for our closing. And this is a mantra you could come back to, touching into the heart, feeling the heart, acknowledging the heart, feeling the heartbeat, acknowledging the heartbeat.
Deep bow of gratitude to you, Michelle. What a wonderful time we've had. It's sacred, and I'm just so grateful to you.
Thank you.
Let's close with a sharing of the merit in metta. May the merit from our time, our conversation, our teachings, our community and care from this community together be of benefit to all beings everywhere. May all beings be free of suffering. May all beings be safe and protected from inner and outer harm. May the collective grief and healing of all beings be honored and seen. May all beings live with love, kindness, and compassion. May all beings everywhere, without exception, be free. Thanks, everybody. I want to thank Cheryl once again for your skilled interpreting for us. And another thanks to our production team, to Margot and Shannon and Glenn. To everybody here and also those listening, appreciate your presence and your generosity in supporting IMCW. Need to do one more moment of fundraising. I thank you all to any who've donated so far. And if you haven't, please consider giving. I think the chat may give you the way to do that. But what's most important is to know that your being here, your participation, your presence, that's the donation. That's the generosity. So we're deeply grateful. Thanks. And coming up, you can check IMCW's newsletter or website for what's coming in August, second Sunday. Feels weird to end on sort of a note like this, but I'm just so grateful. And thank you, Michelle. It's been so wonderful getting to know you.
Thank you.